Quick disclaimer. I've been thinking a lot about the wage gap recently.
The wage gap? Whatever do you mean?
So you know how women on average make less money than men and all that stuff? Yes. I mean wouldn't it make sense that other minoritized groups make less money than white men? I mean yeah, I guess. But is there research on it? I mean yeah, but it's kind of hard to read sometimes. Okay, so you're not presenting it then. I never said that. You made charts? No. No, I didn't. How many did you make? Just a couple. How many is a couple? 7? Look, I mean, it's the easiest way to visualize it, okay? Can you blame me? Anyway, thank you for that skit with myself. And that is right. Today we're talking about the various different age gaps. I thought I'd try a little skit because I thought that was cute. Anyway, I did actually make graphs. They're not on the paper, they're on Excel. So we get cute little digital images for you guys. So are you ready to jump in to the various wage gaps that I have discovered for the United States of America? Okay, so we're starting with the classics, the gender and the race stuff. We're going to focus on the gender first, okay? So the problem with just looking at gender is that that's not the only characteristic marker out there. It's a little disingenuous just to say gender when the real stat I have is for white people. So we've got white men and white women, neither Hispanic, and as we can see from this luna right here, wherever I decide to put it, white women make 79 cents for every dollar that a white man will make. Just on average, those are the only factors are the race and the gender. And that's what we're all used to, we've all heard the 79 cents on the dollar thing. It's a whole thing. We're gonna get into why in a minute, but first, let's just remember that white people aren't the only people in the world. So thank you so much to the research people who can let me make a graph like this. Boom, big graph right in the middle, because there are a lot of categories on here, and it's ranged from the biggest to the smallest. And of course, in green, we have our baselines. That's going to be the non-Hispanic white men again, making $1 on the dollar. The only people on here that are making more than the white men of all the different races of women are going to be the multiracial Asian women, for some reason. I don't know either. It's all very weird and nuanced, but it's cool to know, hey, by 1 whole cent, one group of women are beating out white men. Truly proof of some sort of privilege, right? But no, then we look at the rest of it, and I think Hispanic women making 57 cents on the dollar is kind of bullshit and awful. I'm not sure how y'all feel. I think it's kind of bullshit and awful. And of course, we've got the Native women, but that's from 2019. Everything else is from 2020. There was no new data in 2019. We're going to get into why there's some data missing later, but yeah, we're looking at this, and it's why is the gap so big, I mean, there's so many different reasons why women can be paid less. We've talked about maternity and family leave in a previous video, if you ever wanted to go check that out. Some really good stuff there, super fun. It explains some in the sources down below of what's going on, but really to sum it up, it's just a bunch of biases, a bunch of different things going on. It is not what jobs people take. It is just the life. It is just how people are being paid on average. Take it or leave it. This is what's going on. If you don't accept it, you can feel free to move on. But this is really interesting to me. And I was like, I want to look more into this. So I tried to find a religion wage gap at some point, because I was going nuts over all of this. But instead of a religion wage gap that I found presentable to give, all of them were a little weird and all the stats were different. It was a whole thing. It does exist, was whatever. I found that gender wage gaps tend to be higher in more religiously oriented countries, which I was not expecting to find that stat, but more power to the world. So countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka have much higher gender wage gaps than countries like maybe Sweden or something. I don't know. So the United States, just for a frame of reference here, is 101st in religiosity, and if you see that, there are just over 200 countries in the world. So you know, we're a decent amount. And then we're 90th in the size of the wage gap. So that's pretty close. You know, pretty anecdotal, but it's pretty close. So when we see that, we can kind of see, you know, why the US might have a gender wage gap problem. But then when we move down a little bit, because I've got so many charts on the left side of my screen that I'm looking at right now, so you see me like this, it's because there's a chart. This one I just completely took from Pew Research. Shout out to Pew Research for making charts that I find easy to read, that I don't have to remake. So, boom, here it is. As we can see, like, we've got men and women and race breakdowns. And this is just like median wages. It gives you some more the details on the chart itself. I'm not going to read all of them out. But like when we look at this, oh my god, women are always making less pretty much. The only group of women that are making more than a group of men are going to be Asian women are making more than Hispanic and black men. So that's fun. And then white women are making, what is that? The same amount as black men, you know, in median wage style. Everyone measures their stuff differently. It is very, very hard to compare all this data because everyone is using different measures, different averages. So we're taking it one step at a time, one source at a time. This is source number 2. Don't conflate this with what was happening earlier. We can notice trends, but we cannot make direct comparisons. Cool? Cool. So we look at this and it's like, oh god, oh fuck, that's pretty awful. Yeah. What also came from this Pew Research website. I love Pew Research. They do great stuff for me. You guys know I love my research, and now you know I love graphs. So they also looked at this and they were like, well, has the wage gap narrowed? And since 1980, women have shoved up that wage gap pretty good. Mostly white women have shoved it up. It's different for different races, like black women versus just like men in general, I guess is the stat here. A lot of it's a little bit confusing. I'm not going to lie. I'm not a very big science person, but I do love data. It's only a couple of cents. I believe for white women, it's like 20 cents. But then black women, it's like 5 cents. And it's like, well, why is that? We think about it. We think about it a little bit more. And it might just be racism. Wow. Big word, I know. But, you know, we've got a weird cross of misogyny and racism going on here. So wouldn't it make sense that women of color experience a bigger wage gap at the end of the day? Because they're not only fighting biases against being a woman, but biases against being not white. It's craziness. And then even if we look at this and we're like, well, Asian people are making more than white people, that's still bias, gamers. I hate to break it to you, but all bias is bad. Maybe we're paying Asian people because we, as a society, for some reason, think Asian people are inherently smarter. That's probably why. I mean, there's no like direct proof for this. This is a lot of opinions. There are a lot of opinions happening in this video. But that's probably a solid reason why, you know? So when we look at this, we have to understand that the wage gap does not come from what jobs people hold, but the biases of the people who give them those jobs. Cool? Cool. If you disagree with that, let me know in the comments. Anyway, let's move on to more niche stuff. Disabled people. Disability wage gap is something I've never heard of before, and yet I researched it anyway because as I was starting to do my gender and race stuff, I was like, why haven't I heard of any other wage gaps other than gender and maybe a little bit of race breakdown in there? So I was like, well, is there a disability wage gap? And there is. Oh, there is, my friends, and it is very bad. So here's the first one, very general. I think it's really important to know that I'm going to be very specific about what data is happening. And you need to pay attention to that because we cannot make undue comparisons. Okay, so here we've got disability wage gap just in general with the average abled person and the average disabled person. With the average abled person making $1 on the dollar and the average disabled person making 68 cents on the dollar. 68% of what the average abled person makes. Wow. I saw that and I was like I knew it would be bad, but I did not know it would be bad. And if you were here for the minimum wage video, you know there's this fun thing called sub-minimum wage that we can legally pay disabled people in the United States, and that can be extremely, extremely, extremely low. Like $2 or less an hour. When minimum wage is, I think $7.65? I don't remember. I just know in Ohio it's a little bit over $8, and that's all I care about because I live in Ohio. So seeing this and knowing about subminimum wage and knowing about biases, and even in the last video when we talked about disability in the workplace, there's a lot of stuff that you need more context for apparently. This stat makes sense. Is it good? No. Do I like it? No. Do I know where it's coming from? Yes. This is not just some like magic thing that came out of nowhere. No, this is a culmination of a bunch of different biases and issues in the system that are coming together to screw with our wages. Super fun stuff. But then, of course, we take it deeper because we never stop at the surface. Is there a difference with disability and gender? Yes. Yes, there is. So here we've got our white gender wage gap that I presented earlier. You know, the 79 cents in the dollar. We all know it. We all hate it. And over here, we've got my disability wage gap by gender. And disabled men make $1 on the dollar for this one. That's the important distinction here is we're not focusing on the last stat, we're onto a new stat now. $1 on the dollar for disabled men. And for disabled women, 72 cents on that dollar. So we see at 79 cents versus 72 cents. And now that's 72 cents. That's just the average disabled woman. We're not accounting race into that. So if we look at white women and then disabled women, there's probably more people of color in this than in the non-Hispanic white people category if I were to take a random guess. So that's probably why the 72 cents is lower. But it could also be lower because of increased biases that come with being disabled and being a woman. You know, that intersectionality, when two things intersect to create bigger problems. It's super fun. But that is my personal analysis of those data sets. And I think it's just super fun to look at. Just because someone is one category of minoritized does not mean they're completely exempt from another category of minoritized. They still get affected, just like double as much. It's super fun. Anyway, we haven't covered all the groups in the United States. You know who we've missed as of right now that we're about to cover next? A group I am personally a part of. So the great thing about LGBT stats is they tend to get a little extensive in the world. It's a little crazy. I love it. It's a little crazy. So first we're going to start with the general pay gap because that's where I just like to start. We get general, then we get specific. So here's the general one. We're going to make it big on the screen because there's a lot happening on this one. So we start with the average worker, $1 on the dollar. Okay? So this is not white men. This is not men. This is the average worker in the United States. Very important distinction there. So we move on. Asian Pacific Islander women continue making that $1 on the dollar. Pretty much everyone after the average worker is LGBT. It's important to say that if they're not the average worker, they belong in some way to the LGBT community, whether or not I have the distinction in front of the word or not. So LGBT API women, $1 on the dollar. Then LGBT men, 96 cents on the dollar. That's fun, isn't it? We're not used to seeing men take a little bit of a hit. But men can also be minorities. It's a little crazy, I know. But there are wage gaps that affect men. Craziness. We move on to white women, another 96 cents on the dollar. You know, we go from in general men, no race description, to white women, specifically. There are definitely some missing from this, but it's a pretty long list. I'm just gonna accept it and move on. The average for LGBT is 90 cents on the dollar. You know, not great, not the worst, not the most egregious we've ever seen, but still pretty rough. Women, 87 cents on the dollar. So no race description on there, just LGBT women. Then black women, 85 cents on the dollar. Not too bad, not too bad. Native women, 75 cents on the dollar. That's a big jump. And then we get 72 cents on the dollar for Latina women. Non-binary people, 70 cents. Trans men, not 70 cents. And the worst one we've seen is going to be trans women with 60 cents on the dollar of the general worker. Oh, goodness. That's... let's get that off the screen. That's bad. Guys, I'm not sure if you knew this. That's bad. My favorite thing about the trans people thing is that we've got the super fun trans misogyny. So people already are transphobic, just like in general, the United States was not made for trans people. I'm not sure if you knew this, the United States was mostly just made for white men. It's just part of life. It's just part of our history. We gotta accept it. So, trans men making 70 cents on the dollar, that's absolutely awful. Trans men are people that are born biologically female and transition to male, in case you did not know. So, there could be some misogyny about their birth sex. It could be that there's just people having an issue with trans people, considering non binary people are at the same status, 70 cents on the dollar. That could be it. I don't really know. I'm not quizzing everything that's happening. I'm not one of the researchers. I'm just looking at it. What I think is fun is when we go past non binary and trans people making that 70 cents on the dollar, we hit trans women making 60 cents on the dollar. And if you did not know, the biggest problem facing the LGBT community considering safety is the murder and assault of trans women of color. I don't need to look up a stat for that because I know it by heart. Because I'm recording this on the Trans Day of Remembrance. There are lists out there. If you want to know how many trans people have been killed in the last year because of being trans, it's out there. And it is horrifying. And most people on there are trans women of color. Now, unfortunately, on this stat, we don't have a race breakdown. Like we don't have trans black women versus trans white women. But seeing that trans women are already at such a major disadvantage compared to the average worker is so upsetting to see. But speaking of women, we're going to move past the depression a little bit because that's not what this video is about. It's important, but it's not what we're talking about here today. We're talking about wage gaps. So let's look at just LGBT women in the race wage gap. Just zoom in a little bit. So again, we've got our little green being just women in general in the LGBT community making 87 cents on the dollar. And this is mostly just on here to just really zoom in on what's going on with women in the LGBT community. And trans women are on there because trans women are women, and if anyone tells me otherwise, your comment's getting deleted. So when we look at this, it's bad. We see a jump of 12 cents from Latina women to trans women. That is awful. That's so terrible. I don't like that. I don't like the big jump down to trans women. And of course, I'm going to give the disclaimer of I think everyone should be making $1 on the dollar. I don't like the wage gap. I'm not sure if I've made that clear enough, but I hate the wage gap. But seeing how big it gets once you add the word trans in there, more people need to be talking about how bad the LGBT gap is, especially when it comes to trans people, because this is ugly and this is awful. And I'm going to jump into some problem with information later. I'm getting ahead of myself. We've got one more group to go through. Immigration status. If you lived in the United States or have been paying attention to US news at all recently, you know that there's like a big thing about immigration in the US, and it's ugly. It's really ugly. So I was like, I wonder if there's a difference between people who are native or natural citizens. I used the phrase native citizen because the phrases they used didn't make sense to me in the article. So for all intents and purposes, native citizen is someone who is not an immigrant. Cool? Cool. So we've got native citizen versus immigrant. Boom! Here it is. So we've got $1 on 83.3 cents, which is because the percentage given to me on the website was 83.3%, and I just converted that into dollars and cents for the ease of making graphs, because it makes more sense to my brain this way. So it's not super egregious, but it is there. And in case you're like, but broski, that's not a lot of information. There's certainly more about this, right? And you'd be correct. There is a gigantic article down below that anyone can access for free to talk about the issue with like the immigration wage gap in the United States. And it breaks it down so hard that I would have to dedicate an entire 20 to 30 minute video just to break down all of the information given in that article. And I simply do not have the capacity for that. And this is already getting extremely long. But one thing I'd like to point out from reading that article is I noticed that white immigrants, so, when we think white immigrants, we're going to think European people, right? White immigrants in the United States make more than white native citizens on average. And that's pretty crazy to me. I'm like, look at this immigration wage gap. I was not expecting that. So it could be that we perceive Europeans as smarter. in America. There's still bias there. There is always bias. It is so important to note that there is always bias, and that is a big reason why wage gaps exist. Yay! And now we're going to talk about an issue with my research, because there was a problem. I'm going to call this the information problem. The problem is there's not a lot of information on a bunch of different types of wage gaps, and a lot of the information out there, like with the immigration one, is really dense and can be hard to read just because of how academic it is. So why is that? Because I noticed this. I was like, why earlier in my race and gender breakdown was the data for Native women from 2019 when we got data for every other subgroup of women for 2020? Like, what the heck's going on here, you know? So a big theme is that if someone was white, there's more data. Craziness, I know. So there's going to be a lot of opinions on this because I am not an expert. And I'm sure you've already realized there's a lot of opinions in this video. And I'm probably going to have multiple disclaimers throughout the video that there are opinions happening. But it's a problem I started to notice, like with the information issue, when I moved past just the gender race. Like I said earlier, I had to go through multiple articles to find good LGBT gap information. And even then, it felt a little like not out of touch, but it didn't mesh together well with anything else. Even the same data on the same website didn't mesh together super crazy well. I did a lot of meshing in my graphs. That's why there were graphs, was because a lot of this data was hard to just like read and understand. It had to be visualized. And I was like, why am I having so much trouble trying to find stuff about disabilities and LGBT wage gaps? Because they exist. They mathematically exist. So what's the problem here? And the problem, I think, is that historically white people have power. And change happens when white people fight for it. I mean, like, we see that women earn the right to vote, the right to vote in 1920, but black women did not hold that same right until many years later. So clearly, white women got an advantage over not white women. So could it be that because the gender pay gap is kind of talked about a lot by white women, is that why we know about it? Is it because it affects the white people amongst us, the people with the racial power in the United States? Could the reason we don't hear about things like the LGBT wage gap is because queer people just don't hold that same power that cis-het white women do? Probably. People aren't going to listen to me when I talk about stuff because they're going to assume I'm a crazy alphabet person who just has a bunch of pronouns and doesn't care about facts. But when a conservative white woman, or a white woman who may come off as a little conservative, or a woman who's just white, starts saying things, we're probably going to listen more as a society than when a black woman says things. Because historically, that's just how it's been. And it's not good. And I don't endorse it. And I don't like it. But that's probably a good chunk of what's happening here. I don't know. I thought it was really important to bring up because it's not that I didn't look, but it's because even when I was doing the same amount of effort I did for the gender and race wage gaps, the information just wasn't there. I put the same amount of effort into every single one of these categories, but clearly research became less as time went on, as I got deeper and I got into groups that may be more marginalized or maybe not cared about as much in the United States. It's just a lot to think about. We got Pew Research stuff at the beginning, but then when we got to LGBT, I was going from straight LGBT sources. It wasn't big official national sources anymore. It was very detailed group-oriented stuff. That's what started to happen. And I think that's really interesting. I think it's important to acknowledge that there's probably a bigger issue out there that we're just not able to see because no one has looked into it. Because the people in power don't care enough. And that's the opinion. That's the opinion, is that the people in power don't care, and that's why we don't know enough about all of this. And that is why I went over so many groups today. So I always go over this. How do we fix the problem? How are we going to minimize a wage gap? The thing is, fixing the wage gap is all things I've really talked about before on this channel. So if you've seen the other videos, you're going to have much more of an easier time understanding this, because I've talked about the deeper stuff behind it. And if I sound defeated, it's because I am. Because I'm tired of saying the same things over and over and over again, knowing they're probably not going to happen. But minimizing the wage gap, you can raise minimum wage. Makes sense, you know. Get wages higher for all people. Will probably minimize that gap. Increase wage transparency. That's a new one, which is really exciting. So if everyone knows what everyone else is being paid, it's a lot easier to see if there's any discrepancies in there. But even though it's like, it's this whole thing, like I was telling my mom once that my coworkers never talking about our pay. And she was like, oh, you're not supposed to do that. And I was like, why? She's like, oh, it's just not appropriate. But why? It's not against the rules or anything. At my workplace at the time, of course. No one ever said, don't talk about your pay. We just talked about it, and it was like, okay, we're seeing an issue here. We're definitely seeing a problem. So talk about your wages. If it's not against the rules, talk about them. Maybe avoid talking about them in front of your managers for safety reasons, so you can keep your job, just in case they decide to do something illegal. But yeah, you should be talking about it. And then, of course, next we got unionizing. Because again, if we're thinking about being better with wages, unions are like, that's like the next thing you do. Next is making scheduling practices more fair, which I thought was really interesting. So like, it's detailed more in the source below that I got all of this from. It doesn't make a whole bunch of sense to me because I've never worked on making a schedule before, but it's more about making sure the hours stay consistent, people get the hours they ask for, you're not cutting back on hours unfairly, stuff like that. Expanding paid family and medical leave, like we've talked about before, with maternity leave and such. It's important to have that. It's good for everybody, pretty much. Next, kind of in that same vein, increasing access to childcare so people can actually work. You know, it's great. It's wonderful. And then probably one of my favorite ones is don't base someone's salary on their history of salary, because if they're already experiencing a wage gap, you'd just be perpetuating it by depending on their last salary for what you should pay them now. So just like don't do that if you're the one in charge of that. You should improve work-life balance expectations. So let people go home on time. Pretty please. Remember the quiet quitting video? Let people do that. It's not bad. And then the last one, which businesses can really do and should be doing, honestly, is conducting pay audits. So an audit is really just when you get a third person or a third party to come into a company and just like get info on it. Just like, what's going on here? What's really going on? Because they don't have bias about it. And a pay audit would just be like, what's everyone getting paid? What's the distribution? What's the demographics? What is everything looking like? And that can very easily expose wage gaps if they're there. So yeah, that's all I could find with like fixing it. You know, okay. I got very pessimistic towards the end of that. But I think it's important to note all of this can be fixed, and it will be fixed one day. I have full faith in that. But we need more information. We need more research. We need more people talking about this. So I'm going to do something I have never asked before. Share the video. Oh, I feel like a sellout. Share the video. This is a video I've worked extremely hard on. I made pretty much all those graphs by hand, unless I explicitly said I copied and pasted them. I made all those in Excel myself. I copied and pasted over data. I organized it. I colored it in. I screwed around with it a lot. I'm proud of the work I've done here, and I think it's important that people can find all of this information in a simple place. And I'm sure if you've watched to the end, you probably think that too. So, yeah. If you're worried about anything, or if you have any comments or concerns or additional things I may have missed, let me know in the comments, because, like, please get down there. Please talk to me. I need to know real people watch this. Yeah. I guess with that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope your pay is equal to the white man sitting next to you. And if you are the white man, I hope it's similar. I hope your pay is similar to the person next to you who's not a white man. Anyway, see ya.